Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Buenos días a todos. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos.
We'll wait just a minute to give everyone time to join us.
Vamos a esperar unos minutos para darle tiempo a las personas a ingresar a la plataforma.
Okay, well, welcome. I will start. My name is Alex Arnold. I'm the executive director of the Taos Institute, and we're very pleased to offer this event in English and Spanish.
Buenos días a todos y todas. El nombre de ella es Alex Arnold, es la directora ejecutiva del Instituto Taos. Y esta actividad se estará ofreciendo en español y en inglés.
And we want to start by thanking Edgardo Morales and Sylvia London for their translation today. Thank you.
Y quiero agradecer a Edgardo Morales, que es mi nombre, y a Silvia London, que vamos a ser los traductores durante el día de hoy.
So to listen in Spanish, we will set up a Spanish audio channel.
Así que para que puedan escuchar en español, vamos a organizar o crear un canal de idioma en español.
And this is where you will be able to listen to Sylvia speaking in Spanish as the dialogue continues in English in the main channel.
Y de esta forma es que van a poder escuchar a Silvia traducir el contenido del diálogo al español.
So to join the Spanish channel, as soon as I open it, you will see a globe, an icon with a globe at the bottom of your screen.
Así que para unirse al canal en español, van a notar tan pronto ella lo haga, que van a ver un icono de un globo terráqueo en la pantalla, la parte es debajo de la pantalla.
And when you click on the globe, you can choose it. You can access the interpretation feature and you can choose whether you want to listen in English or in Spanish. That's how you join.
Así que cuando vean el icono, pueden cliquear el icono y van a ver que le da la opción de escuchar en inglés o de escuchar en español. Y pueden apretar el español y así entrarán en el canal en español.
And before you join, I would ask you to mute yourself and please stay on mute during the conversation until we get to the question and answer.
Sí, entonces, antes de entrar, les pediría que se coloquen en silencio, tocando el icono del micrófono para que no interfieran con la traducción o con lo que está ocurriendo en el diálogo.
Okay, so I am opening the channel now.
Y que estoy abriendo el canal ahora.
The globe.
Deberían poder ver un globo terráqueo.
So we will just give a moment to everyone.
Quiero darle un momento para que puedan integrarse.
And if you have any questions or trouble joining, please be patient. You can put your questions in the chat and we will help you in just a few minutes after we get started with our conversation.
Así que si tienen alguna dificultad para entrar, por favor, déjenoslo saber a través de una pregunta en el chat y entonces trataré de responder lo más rápido posible una vez comience la conversación, el diálogo.
Great. Well, thank you, Edgardo. I think Sylvia is taking it from here, so thank you very much. And we are getting started. So this event is hosted by the Taos Institute in collaboration with Montaber Publishing. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit educational organization, and we have a mission to create brighter futures one conversation at a time. We disseminate social constructionist, relational, and appreciative ideas and practices across disciplines, languages around the world. And we do so by offering workshops, courses, many free events like this dialogue with the author. We also have many books published by Taos Institute Publications, and especially a World Share book series. These are free downloadable books. I invite you to check our website to explore the many books that are available there in many languages. We also have an online community, the Taos Institute Commons. It is free and open to all. Most likely you have joined this event today through the Taos online community, and it is a place where you can find other events, other resources, and most importantly, connect with each other. So we really invite you to post your own announcements, your questions, your reflections, and reach out to each other so that we can all together nurture this global online community. And we are here today to celebrate the publication of 2 new Spanish translations by Montaber Publishing. So we have here today Taos Associate Adrià Gibernau, not only representing Montaber Publishing, but also as the translator of one of these books himself. And Adrià will be facilitating the conversation with our authors present today. So we have Ken Gergen, Sheila McNamee, Emerson Rasera, and Pedro Martins. So thank you all for being here, and Adrià, welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone in America, and good afternoon here in Europe. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Adrià Gibernau, and I am one of the editors of Montaber Publishing, where we have just started a new collection of books about psychology. Actually, it's not a regular collection of books about psychology, but it's what I called books of counter-hegemonic psychology. So actually here, as we will see afterwards, we are doing a political act as well. Besides that, I'm also working in my PhD in discursive psychology here in Barcelona, in Universitat Pompeu Fabra. And as Alex was saying now, I'm an associate of the Taos Institute. And at the same time, I was the translator of the Relational Imperative, a book written by Ken Gergen that we will be presenting today. So basically, I would like to talk to you a little bit about how this conversation will happen. The authors that I will present right now will be talking for 45 till 50 minutes. And they will be having a conversation. They will be having a chat between them. And we kindly ask you to pose your questions, to write your questions in the chat down here, either in Spanish or in English. And we will send them to the speakers, to the authors, as soon as they have done with their initial presentation, that it will last until 5 p.m. here in Spain till 11 a.m. if I'm not wrong in New York time. So today we're presenting 2 books, and we are presenting, I will be telling a little bit about these books. First of all, the one that I translated myself, that it was a great pleasure to translate it, that it's called The Relational Imperative, El Imperativo Relacional in Spanish. And this book, I like to call it as an invitation to dance. And I think that Ken will really agree on that because he uses that metaphor quite a lot. And I think that it's a book that it's kind of accessible. Everyone can read it, but this doesn't mean that it's simple in terms of complexity of theoretical terms that appear there. This book is presenting, and actually I think it's a battle book somehow. It's a shorter book than another book that was published in 2009, that it was called The Relational Being. And this is a short book that it's presenting these ideas of the relational theory that Ken will be telling us after in a while. And basically what it's presenting is this idea that maybe we can take a look at the individuals as separate entities, but Ken is telling us, it's inviting us to understand the human world instead of as individuals isolated, as relationships, and understanding that the relationship is at the beginning of everything. And this book is, I mean, personally, I think it's fantastic. It's so interesting. And actually, the first 2 chapters talk about the relational theory. And then there are 4 chapters specific, focused on education, healthcare, organizations, and governance. Ken will tell us a lot more about that, but let me go to the other book. And actually, you will see that Alex will be sharing the links here in the chat. I hope that you are able to see them. Alex will be sharing the links in English. Then we'll go to the links in Spanish, and I will give you some details after that. But some introduction about that book that was written by Sheila McNamee, by Pedro Martins, and Emerson Rasera. That it's called Practicing Therapy as Social Construction. This is based in a book written several years ago by Ken and Sheila. But back then, we would say that that was the theoretical book, and now we're bringing all these ideas of how to understand therapy as a social construction to practice. However, this doesn't mean that this book goes away from theory. Actually, I think that the ideas shared here take in account many things related to the theoretical world, and actually the authors bring them all together in order to give their, let's say, solution when it comes to therapy. How should it be understood? And I would like to highlight 4 things about this book, and for sure the authors will be talking about that afterwards. One of the things that really struck me the most was the idea of the activist therapist. And I will not go into detail with that. I will let the authors talk about this during this presentation. But the thing is that what they are understanding is that therapy has to be understood from an ethical perspective, or at least they present this doubt that usually therapy has been understood as part of the healthcare realm. And in the healthcare realm, it is understood that science is what it is. We will go into that, no? But what they are understanding is that there has to be an ethical perspective, and because for sure the subjects, the clients that go to therapy are embedded and surrounded and constituted by social discourses. These social discourses that, as we will see before, I hope, they call them either macro discourses or micro discourses. And with all this perspective, what they are bringing into question, if this idea of the classical psychology or orthodox psychology of evaluation and diagnose, does it really make sense? So from here, I don't know, I know that several of you arrived here, and actually, Silvia, I will ask you for a second to not translate, or maybe translate also in Spanish. Pero me gustaría decir que para la gente que ha entrado ahora, pueden tener la traducción simultánea. En la parte inferior deben ver un icono con una figura de un globo terráqueo. Cliquen ahí y van a poder tener acceso a la traducción simultánea hecha por nuestra compañera Silvia London en directo. Going back to English, some technical issues. I would like to introduce you the authors that we have here. It is a great pleasure to have them. But before introducing them and giving them the floor, I would like to say that for this event, for this occasion, from my publishing house, we are giving a 20% of discount to the books that we are presenting today. And Alex just shared the link here. You only have to enter the link and insert this code, this voucher, that it's Taos 24. You have to create an account, but it's you will only be asked for your name and your email. And from here, you will be able to read this book in streaming. That's important to say. You cannot download it in PDF. And you'll be able to read this book with that 20% of discount. Said this, we can go to the main characters of this talk. Let me introduce you, Emerson Rasera, first of all. It is a great pleasure to have you here. Emerson is a psychologist and professor at the Federal University of Uberlândia in Brazil. He is also a broad member of the Taos Institute, and he's interested in social constructionist contributions to psychological practice, especially when it comes to healthcare, community work, and issues of sexual diversity. Then let me introduce you the other author of Practicing Therapy as Social Construction, that is Pedro Martins. Pedro Martins I have here now. Pedro is also a Taos Associate, and he's a clinical psychologist with a background in mental health practices and families. And his work is dedicated to try to bridge this eternal gap that it seems that appears always between research and the theoretical side and the real therapy in very different ways. Then the last author of this book of Practicing Therapy as Social Construction is Sheila McNamee. She's a professor emerita of communication at the University of New Hampshire. She's the co-founder, she was the co-founder and the vice president of the Taos Institute. He's working toward the realization of the relationally sensitive world where diversity is embraced and human differences can somehow coexist and enrich each other peacefully. One of her last books that actually I have here, and it's an honor to share with you, this is off the record somehow. It is this book written with Celiane Camargo Borges. It's called Design Thinking and Social Construction, and it's a wonderful book, so a big recommendation from here. And finally, our last speaker, I guess that known for several of you, it's Kenneth Gergen. He's a senior research professor in psychology at Swarthmore College and the president of the Taos Institute. He is internationally known for his contributions to social constructionist theory, technology, cultural change, the self, aging, education, relational theory and practices, and he has given lectures all around the world. And now I'm happy to announce that I think that, if I am right, Ken, you were designated as a highly ranked scholar by Scholar GPS. And this means that you are in the top 0.05 scholars of the whole world with the more impact of their publications. So big congratulations for that. I think this should have arrived way before. And finally, Ken is also known by several books. Some of them are translated into Spanish, but I will only say a couple of them, like The Saturate Itself, that it is translated into Spanish, and also The Relational being the book that we were talking before. So, last time, let me remind for those that are Spanish speakers that arrived a little bit late, para aquellos que llegaron tarde y quieren tener la traducción simultánea en castellano, abajo tendrán que encontrar un globo terráqueo, clicar ahí y darle al canal de español, y a partir de ahí van a empezar a escuchar a nuestra compañera Silvia London, que les va a ir traduciendo. Okay, back to English. So here I will leave the floor to you, and actually I would like to ask you, Ken, because your book is talking about relational theory, and here today we're talking about therapy as a political act, no? And I think that this idea is really embedded in the notion of social construction. Which is the connection between the relational theory, social construction, and understanding therapy as a political act?
Good. Thank you, Adrià, very much for your gracious introduction, for translating my book, and for making this event possible. Incredible resource. A little bit more about my book. I don't want to say so much because we have a topic at hand. But I think for probably most of the last decade, I have been enormously concerned with the existential problems with which we are faced globally, and particularly the place of the social sciences and our practices and healthcare and so on, and where we stand, how we contribute, what do we have to say in these terms? Because no longer do I feel we can occupy these small niches where we talk to each other and we give gold stars out for what we do and love each other. Those days are ended for me. I think we have to think where we stand, what we offer, how we can change our practices in order to make some contribution to what you could look at as a sort of the last stand of humanity. I look at the doomsday clock reaching its end, and I'm concerned. So that's part of the reason for the book on the relational imperative, because the issue there was, I do not think we offer much if we continue to confine our focus on single individuals or any kind of individual compartmentalized object or entity. That is, For example, in our Western heritage, the very focus on the individual person's well-being, and basically the subject of therapy, by and large, or the family as an entity, or a community as an entity, or indeed a nation. To move away from the focus on the entities to ask about and to explore and to create concerns for the relational process out of which these entities emerge. As the general proposal is, we emerge from the relational process. We are not prior to that process. So that everything we do, everything that we say, everything that is concern for us emerges within that process of which no one is in control. It is essentially a process in which we are all involved, in which we become the persons that we are. So how to bring that into being, how to think about that, how to practice it, where does it lead us? Part of that's in the book, but I was very much drawn to the work on social construction and practice, not simply because Sheila and I, some 30 years ago, edited a book which attempted to bring together those voices that were speaking at the time, but because what these authors had done was to take that much, much further. When we began that enterprise and were collecting people for that book, the entity that was of concern was either the individual in therapy, or the therapeutic dyad, or the family process. They were all within process concerns. And this book, which I just thought fantastic, breaks out of the shell and begins to ask about therapy within the broader practices, not only of the communities, but you might say the nations and onward. So this was a major step for me. I appreciated that just enormously. It raised all sorts of concerns. It's really fascinating to me. Where do we take this? Because as we're going to see today, there are obviously political concerns here. How far are we to push those concerns? Is this book going to be the Paulo Freire of therapy? Are you willing to take it that far? And if so, what is that going to mean for the future of therapy and so on? So I'm really open to this discussion. And Sheila, I appreciate if you sort of take it from there and see where we go.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And Adrià, thank you. And Sylvia and Edgardo for translating and for all of you being present. I think we all really look forward to this conversation. So in the book, Practicing Therapy as Social Construction, we really are trying to move away from the earlier focus in therapy that was focused on micro level, what we call micro level interactions. And those micro level interactions in our focus there really were quite apolitical almost all the time. There, some pockets of people doing more political work, but generally apolitical. And what we have, I'd say the cornerstone of this book is to acknowledge that once we step into a relational perspective, a constructionist perspective, that we cannot separate the micro level interactions with which we engage every day with each other and with our environments. We cannot separate those from the creation of what we call macro level discourses, or you might refer to it as dominant discourses or institutional discourses. Those things, in other words, that we generally take for granted. So we could say the dominant discourse or the institutional discourse of medicine is so taken for granted that you don't even question the fact that when you feel unwell, you seek help from a medical professional. It's just what you do. So that kind of recognizing that those macro level taken for granted ways of being only exist insofar as we continue to keep them alive. So we are part of creating them, we are part of maintaining them, and thus we can be part of changing them as well. And that's where I think the political edge comes, looking at therapy as a form of social activism. That doesn't mean the therapist pushing a client or a couple or a family or a group into a particular direction politically. It simply means acknowledging this inseparable relationship between what we do together and the kinds of worlds that we live in, and recognizing alongside that there are different people interacting in different ways in different moments in history, in different cultures, in just the different neighborhood, create different taken for granted discourses. And so that there are multiple ways that we can begin, when we begin to see that relationship, we can question and resist certain forms of being, certain institutional discourses, and work to change them. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the kickoff of it. Emerson, Pedro, chime in, either one of you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for this great team that we are here together making it happen. When I hear Ken and Sheila talking about the book and the connections between therapy and social construction and politics, I think that in our book, what we try to do is to really take seriously the word social of social construction. Because what we're trying to say that when we think about social, we mean the interactional, but we also mean the cultural, the historical, and the political. For me, it's really important to have, I would say, a political gaze, a way of seeing things that emphasizes the political implications of our discourses and practices. So in the book, we try to highlight and offer examples of how to be or how to have a therapeutic activism. And what we mean by that? We are trying to say that there are different ways of professionals, of psychologists, of therapists trying to change the world. And why it's important? Because many clients, when they come to therapy, their suffering are based on specific social discourses. And in the therapeutic encounter, many times we try to help this client to have another way of making sense of that experience. But much of the suffering comes from these social discourses. So the question is, what we as therapists can do to help change this context. So, for example, when we become allies with our clients to change some biomedical views of the suffering. And for example, there is the hearing movement, the hearing voices movement, and they question the idea of hallucinatory, and they think that the voices people hear are just part of their life, and they have to deal with them. And so, they're trying to create other discourses. I see many trans clients, and they suffer a lot, not because transsexuality in itself is a problem, but because of the prejudice they face in their lives. And then they become depressive, suffer a lot because of that. I think that we as therapists, we have resources, we have ways of helping all these clients to change the things. And I'm saying that we're not talking just with the particular clients that we're talking with in the session, but we are also talking about collective action, about inviting many clients, many people interested in that topic, and trying to change the way we talk about that and the practices, biomedical practices, health practices around that issue. So these are some of the ways I see that we can be political, especially through this invitation of going beyond the office, beyond the consultation room, and trying to do things differently. In the literature, we have many examples, but I think that we also need to create other ways of doing that. I think this is the challenge. What can we do to create new possibilities of personal and social change? Pedro, I was thinking about, I'm talking about beyond the consultation room, but I think that you inside the consultation room is trying to address also these issues. I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to talk about that, and thanks everyone who's here, who's joined us here today. As I was listening to the others speak, I am reminded that for me, the greatest potential of social constructionist theory is we're not trying to destroy any kinds of traditions, but we are trying to make it visible how they are traditions. And in making that visible, we become interested in how did that come to be, and how useful can that tradition be, and who's gaining and who's losing from the use of that tradition. And most importantly, if that's not useful, or if that's hurting someone, or if that's abusive, can we shift the tradition? Where else can we find inspiration? And so I think that's one of the greatest potentials of social construction to me. And when I think about therapy as a political act, the first thing that comes to mind is whenever we say something, we have to realize that we're participating in a certain tradition. And so that's an option, right? So you're opening up some possibilities and closing other possibilities. And I am reminded that no matter where you are, if you're talking one-on-one with a client, or if you're in a big political party, giving a speech, social construction reminds me that meanings are worked out in conversation. And I think that's, who knows better how to talk, how to manage conversation than therapists. So I think that's a great potential of the therapists have. How can we create better conversations in the world so we can maybe create better futures? That's one way of looking at it. And as a clinical practitioner, I am inside the office most of my day. And what I really like about these ideas is that even if I am inside the office, I recognize that the way people live their lives, social discourses are not out there, they're in here. Everything is together. So I am positioning myself, I am positioning the other, and together we're trying to make sense of what's going on and what kinds of options do we have. And when we think from that perspective, our options are broadened, so we can go outside the office, for example, or we can bring other people into the office, or, we can question how does this thing that I think it's my problem individually in my mind is part of a tradition that is saying that is a problem. So I just want to emphasize again, what I really like about this is we're broadening our options. And just one last note for this part. When Ken started talking about the challenging times that we're living in, I think that in 2024, it is impossible to be a therapist and not recognize how much, this specific moment in time is part of people's sufferings. I mean, it is possible, but you have to be blind, so climate change and, everything that we know, it comes into our offices. And I am reminded of this quote by Antonio Gramsci, who is a Marxist author. And he says that we can be pessimistic on the level of analysis, but optimistic on the level of action. And that's really helpful to me. So maybe Ken, if you would like to take it from here and say something about the challenging times that we're living in.
Let me take the optimism, pessimism issue a little bit forward here, because there's a question that's lurking here for me, is that the one flavor of politics within the book that we did 30 years ago was essentially narrative therapy and Michael White, because he did have a political consciousness. And indeed, some of the moves that you're making are very much echoing those kinds of moves. Look, there are certain oppressive forces at work within the system. Part of therapy is liberating oneself from those forces, moving out of the dominant discourse. Now, what White did was to try to replace, let's say, the problematic narrative with another narrative. And this is the part that I always sort of fell away from Michael, because it somehow just gave a person another story to live in. And living in any story to me was a limitation, which I think is at the tip of what you're also saying, that is to open up the options. All right, now Michael replaced one sort of sureness with another, and you're replacing it with the opening of options, which I have a lot of sympathy for. But given the open options, what then? Is there a vision of, in terms of politics, not just simply, okay, now you're free, because there's no freedom, there's only options. There are only options for forms of relationship. And I don't have an answer to this. I'm just kind of curious what you might do with it. Is there a directionality there? Is there almost a implicit vision of what a good future might be for the world?
A couple of things come to mind immediately in response to that, Ken. One is that the idea of options is such when people come with problems and all of a sudden the problem isn't inside them and isn't their pathology, the idea of options can be in and of itself liberating. So the direction or which option is taken doesn't really matter anymore. There's that kind of liberation. And also embedded in seeing this and seeing these, that there are options, there is a very clear articulation of exactly what a constructionist perspective is all about, without having to teach anyone about social construction, that the ways in which we relate to one another create possibilities and constraints, as Pedro pointed out. And if you kind of have a sense of that, and a sense that your own shift or change in the way you relate to someone or something has the possibility to create and open up other options, other possibilities, that's, in traditional terms, we'd say that's agency, right? But I don't want to call it that, but that is giving to people who come to therapy usually feel they have no options, no ability to do something. And so this is creating that open space. I'm thinking, Emerson, that maybe you want to give the example of your work with the community.
Thank you, Sheila. Before doing that, I think that I would like to comment on this question Ken brought to us. For me, when you're talking about macro discourses and micro relationships, and what is the future, what we will have to do in order to get this future come to reality, I think that we don't have the answer, but I think that trying to think about that is really important, because sometimes in the therapeutic field, people still sustain a view that the therapist has to be neutral. All his actions have to sustain a view of neutrality. But we know that's not possible to be neutral. And it's really different, not being neutral and trying to impose an agenda. They are not the same thing. We are not trying to impose an agenda, but we are not neutral. Our questions, our way of understanding, they are always based on certain values. So I think that when we invite therapists to talk about politics, what we're trying to do is to remind them that they are not neutral. All their practices are based on some values. And how can we sustain the relativist view of social construction? And at the same time, how can we have some values? I think that the important thing is not that we have a theoretical discourse about what is a great society. I think what's important is that we take a stance of relational responsibility and think that with our peers, within our community, we have to make deliberations. And they're going probably to be different from one context to another. But we have to go beyond this neutral view. And Sheila, how to do that? You invite me to talk about some of my experiences within the community. During my PhD, I was the therapist of a support group for people living with HIV/AIDS. It was in the 90s. The reality was completely different from what we have today. And in the group, there was an issue that they were not having access to medication. As a therapist, I could do many different things. How to face the situation, how to understand that, how they feel about that. But what we became to do was to recognize that the challenge, they shared the same challenge. And it was something that happened because the political situation we had in Brazil. So what clients began to do is that in small groups, they decide to go to the people responsible for offering this medication. Brazil has a national public health system and it's free for everybody. So they went there to try to solve this problem. And based on this experience, they decided that they would create a nonprofit for fighting and advocating the rights of people living with HIV/AIDS. So in the beginning, I was there to help take care of them, but I didn't have this idea of, I need to teach them how to do advocacy and how to create a non-government organization. No, it was not on my mind. My mind was just how can we understand that a shared problem is not based on personal issues, but they're based on social issues, and how we can change that. So this is a form of therapeutic activism. And there are other ways. For example, when we have legislations that are against our clients, I think that we have to do something with that. It's not just how to cope, how to deal with these horrible legislations. No, I think this would be to make psychological what is actually social, and I think that we have to avoid that. So, as experts, they say that we are expert, and this is the only time I think it's good to be an expert. We go there when we talk with other politicians, and we try to make the regulations different. So, these are ways of being political inside the consultation room, inside, the therapeutic dialogue, and also beyond that. I think these are two examples, Sheila, in my own life of how I try to connect the micro relationships with the macro discourses and macro social convictions that were causing so much suffering for all these clients.
And I think what's interesting in the work that you've done, Emerson, is that when we talk about therapy as a political act, I think it's very easy for people to think that the therapist has a political agenda that is now to be imposed upon clients. And your illustrations are really good illustrations that that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, I like the way you put it, taking something that's social and making it psychological is not what we want to do. We want to keep it and recognize it, acknowledge it, and allow the people that we work with to see this as a social issue. And running through this conversation, I keep thinking, this is no different than education as well. Education is therapeutic, I would say, and education is political. And of course, we see in our contemporary moment that education is under fire as well as just about everything else. But to stop making every issue something that is a pathology or a problem for the person and recognize the social basis of it is important.
I just want to add that I think there is an inherent tension in what we're discussing, because on the one hand, we want to open up options and realize how every tradition is socially constructed. And I think that's political in itself. And as Sheila said, so what we are saying is we are responsible for the worlds that we create, and that's a political position. But on the other hand, I do think there are some traditions that we like better than others. And I think Ken's question makes me think about that. So I think we tend to favor traditions where collectiveness over individuals are there, and traditions where people have a voice instead of authoritarian traditions. So what I try to do when I'm thinking about this is just embrace this inherent tension that on the one hand, we are saying, let's investigate different traditions and how they've come about and what possibilities they gave us. But on the other hand, we can simultaneously say, but I am not neutral. This is value-based, and we are trying to create some sort of new future, some sort of new society. So to me, just being able to recognize that this contradiction is here and we're going to have to deal with it, it helps us not having to choose between sort of the epistemological view of social construction or the values-based view, but being able to go back and forth between these depending on what option suits you at the moment.
Let me try to deal with that tension for a moment, because I'd had to work with it in relational being and a little bit in relational imperative too. And I had to, in this case, had to work it out in terms of ethics. And I tried to distinguish between, let's say, a first order ethic, which would be any of the sort of local values we might have, which might, for example, span liberal to conservatism, just for a moment. And you can imagine a conservative therapist liberating their clients from liberalism. All right, I mean, that makes sense. So on a first order level, it seems to me, yeah, we draw from these positions that we have. We feel we believe in them, but we have got nothing to stand on other than they are thrown conditions that we've grown up with or developed. So there's no foundation for them. But they are always potentially embattling, seeking in some way to drown each other out. So if we attack the system, or let's say it's capitalist-based, for example, or the diagnostic system or whatever, I mean, we're coming from a special particular, and we're trying to drown out those voices. So we're working on first order ethics. Now, if that's the case, then therapy just becomes a war of one political activist camp versus another one. What I tried to do with relational being was to say, look, to go back to the social, all those positions come out of a relational process, a growth process in which we come to agreement about something. So at the end of the day, it's the saving and nourishing of that process that is our future. If that process becomes alienating, we're finished. You have to keep the process alive. So it means, in some sense, when you say options, yeah, that gets close to being the process. That option cannot drown out the very traditions that you kind of, I wouldn't like to be there. It's got to somehow be inclusive so that in terms of a political, ethical grounding, you might say, of a therapy, could it be in the very nurturing, enlivening enrichment of the process of relating itself, so that it continues to be somewhat what might call it an open conversation or a dance without limits. I'm not sure what the metaphor would be, but it would have to do with a meta orientation to the life-giving possibilities of the process itself.
I think that's
keeping the
where.
conversation.
Go on.
I just want to say, keeping the conversation going, that's an ethical position in itself, right?
Yeah.
But I was going to say that introduces the idea of dialogue, where, how do we move away from trying to adjudicate which belief system is best, which is the right option, to exactly what you're saying, Ken, that to recognize that these locally constructed beliefs and values are rational and sensible in context, and irrational and evil when seen from another context often. And so the only hope to avoid embattlement, like, no, our beliefs are better than your beliefs, the only hope is exactly as you say, to keep the conversation going. So how do we create conditions where we can bring diametrically opposing, incommensurate views together, groups of people together? And I think dialogue is one way to do that, by not starting with judgment or an attempt to persuade, but by starting with curiosity and presuming coherence for the other, even though it doesn't look coherent from your own perspective, and recognizing that that's not sanctioning, that's not saying it's okay. It's a way of opening a conversation, because unless you do that, there is no conversation to be had. There's no interaction to be had. If I'm only judging you, accusing you, blaming you, the interaction ends. There's no process between us. So how do we enter in with some curiosity about what's rational in this different point of view, just to keep the conversation going? And hopefully the goal isn't agreement. I think that that's overrated, agreement, but new forms of understanding emerge. And in those new forms of understanding, that's the place where opportunity is.
Sheila, I think that listening to you right now, I was reminded of the Public Conversations Project. Mm-hmm. And they have a really interesting experience about how to make dialogue possible between people that, demonize each other, they think the other one is an evil, and how we can do that. And they develop a certain kind of methodology, some questions, and they invited people from different opposing groups to talk about. And the idea is not to make any kind of a consensus, but trying to sustain the possibility of having a dialogue. And I think it's really important, because when you're talking about therapy and politics, what they did, it was a contribution from family therapy to political psychology. And this is one thing that's really important to me. And I think that this experience also asks us to think where we are having these conversations. Because one thing is to have this conversation in the context of the office with a client or family. The other one is within the community. And I like to think that some authors talk about therapists as citizen therapists. And I think that's really, I think there is an invitation to think of therapists as citizens, and of thinking about clients as also citizens. That is, we can create conditions to help people change the meanings of their lives, and at the same time, being able to change the context in which they live. And I think a dialogue is a way of doing that. I think that conflict is inherent of this way of living. There are differences and how we deal with that. But I think that for me, the invitation of thinking about therapy and politics is to think that we have to open space for these kind of conversations. And it's an invitation. And I know that, we're not imposing this to everybody. I think that people have to think, is there some room for me to do this in the context in which I live, in the institution that I work? So I think it's an invitation for people, I would say, to sustain this political gaze and think about political implications of the way we work, the way we talk to each other, the way we face the problems that challenge us in our society. So yeah, I think we are citizens. We are part of this big conversation. And how can we participate on that? For me, this is the question. This is the invitation.
Just mindful of the time. Should we wrap this up?
I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Actually, I was waiting for even 1 second to stop you talking, but I mean, it was great, the kind of the discussion that it appeared here. Thank you very much. I take advantage of this time to ask our listeners if they want to make any kind of question. Written, you can write them in the chat. I think we got some of them here. Besides this, thank you very much for those ideas. Actually, while you were talking here, many things appeared, many questions appeared. But there was one that it was interestingly, for me, it was pretty interesting that you mentioned, Pedro, you were talking about traditions. In a certain point, Sheila, you were talking about biomedical view of suffering. And several times we were talking about pathology, about neutrality, about these ideas that are apolitical, no? How does the perspective of psychology as a science enter here? Are we doing science when we are working in psychology? I know that's a really big question, and you could be talking about that for 3 hours more. But I would like to send this question to either of you.
Well, you know, obviously, why is it necessary, important, or helpful to think of psychology as a science? That would be my question. I think the so-called social sciences, it's a misnomer. It's not like a medical, it's not like a virus in the body, right? That you can detect and see and treat with a certain medication. These are, you know, unpredictable, unfolding processes that create all sorts of meanings and implications for our lives. So I have a very hard time thinking in terms of science when we think about psychology.
The empirical, or let's say the natural sciences, that's a tradition. That's a discourse. It has its methods. I mean, the problem with social sciences is they've often tried just to buy that whole perspective and put it in place. And Sheila's right, it doesn't quite fit. That's not to say it's wrong. And there are places where it does fit. There are times when you want to be able to use those. But to think that that is the nature of what we do, it's absolutely strangulating. So it's killing the process of doing social science in the sense of the illumination it might bring, the perspectives it might bring together, what it may offer. I mean, we need far many more discourses at our disposal, including the arts, to be able to do those things. So it's like, yeah, okay, we can take some of that stuff that may be helpful here, especially with population changes over time or something, but it's not in itself, well, it becomes, in fact, fatal if we borrow it wholesale.
Adrià, I think that discussion is important, and it has a long debate around this issue. And Ken wrote a paper in, if I'm not wrong, 1973, Social Psychology as History. And there he questioned all the things. And then we had a crisis in social psychology, exactly because of that. And I know that we are still struggling around these issues. And there are people that think that, you know, you have psychology in one side and politics in the other side, and they are not connected. But what you are doing here is saying that they are connected. There are different views and traditions of science. And obviously, when we are talking the way we are here, we are advocating for a certain view of science. And again, it's not the view, it's just another view. I think that what we're trying to offer is possibility of action for many people. And sometimes they think, oh, because it's not science, so I can't do anything. No, we can. It's just, you know, there are much more traditions to deal with, and life is richer when we have more traditions, more ways of being. And social constructionists usually values all these traditions, are curious about them and what we can learn from them. So it is still a question, but we are trying to think that all things are connected.
And I just want to add that the answer to me depends on who's asking. So if it is in a context where being a scientist is important for you to be heard, then of course it's a science. But if we're here, then we can say all these stuff. So it's not just one thing.
Excellent point. I would just like to add one other piece to this, that I find that this idea of politicizing therapy, or therapy as a political act, actually moves us towards a humanizing approach to therapy and psychology in general, versus, and I don't mean a humanistic, I mean, humanizing, just looking at the embodiedness of being with each other, of being people, and where this thinking of psychology as a science and therapy as a, by association as a science, really is, we kind of step into a sci-fi movie, right? It's like somebody manipulating something behind the scenes, and no art, no dancing, no literature, none of those things that could be seen as something we could learn from and expand our ways of being in the world through participating in.
Well, just to add to that, just a footnote, I've just finished reviewing a book where they're trying to use a lot of work from the arts as dialogue. So dance, participatory storytelling, and so on become parts of the dialogue. They just are woven in as behavioral actions with others, which have a dialogic form and can often influence what is then said later on in terms of verbal dialogue.
Thank you for those answers. I know it was not an easy question to answer. I got a couple of comments here in the chat, and then I think that we can open the floor if someone wants to raise their hand. Feel free to do that. But here, Lucia Palma, it's saying here, I think it's more of a comment, that she's saying that even practicing medicine is more related to art as a continuous creation process, I think. Or I am getting a comment that there was here before, but I cannot see it now anymore. But I think that it was interesting. I think that Nurit was posing that question, that she was saying that this whole thing that we are talking about of making therapy as a political act, it has so much to do with the therapist itself. No, and she was asking if you could discuss about that a little bit. Sorry, because I don't have here the question anymore. I don't know if it disappeared or something, but if you could reply on that, otherwise we can open the floor and change to instead of simultaneous translation to consecutive translation. If you want to make some comments on that, and then we open the floor.
I think that I think it depends on how you define a political act. So from my point of view, everything we do is a political act. And so, then any therapist is engaging in a political act, even when they don't do something that looks expressly political, it's still political. But then, of course, we know that there are also therapists who, Ken, you mentioned Michael White, expressly are trying to point out oppressive narratives that people live with and reconstructing a more livable narrative for a person. And so, there are shades. There's that, a therapist being expressly political, but even the therapist, from my point of view, who's doesn't even think of themselves as doing anything political, is still doing something political. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, I would like to add something here, Sheila. The way I understood Nurit's question, I would say that for me, the answer is that we begin with the therapist. All this conversation is trying to, I don't know exactly how to say that, but to promote some kind of sensibilities with the therapist. So what we are inviting here, I think that most of the people that we have here are probably therapists or something like doing some work around that. What you're inviting here is for therapists to begin to consider the political implications of what they do. I think, yeah, what we're trying to do here is that. So it begins with the therapists, but therapists alone will not do anything. He will have to partner with, he will have to have clients, and including other therapists as partners to do things, to make things happen. So I think we begin with the therapist, and then other relationships are developed and things change. If I understood it correctly, Nuri, and thanks for the question.
I add one little piece to that too, and that is that you focused a lot on the content that is sort of challenging dominant discourses and so on. To point to the what to me may be the more important politics of doing therapy, and that is the form of relationship which you're inviting, how that movement is, the kinds of questions you ask, the way you listen, what you add to it. That whole dance is itself something one can take away from that. It's a way of being that you invite. And I think in some way, people won't remember. I mean, the studies show they don't remember what happens in therapy. But that way of being, I think, remains. They become you, you become them. And that dance is really important.
And Ken, I think that really underscores the most central piece of social construction is the doing and the being of it, not the assumptions or the, do this, not that. It is really in the ways in which we connect with others that we are curious and inviting, and it's the being that's more important than the speaking, I think.
Yeah, and it reminds me, Ken has an expression that is poetic activism. So what you're talking about is ways of talking, new images, new ways of relating to each other. We're not a political party. We don't have a specific agenda. It's not that. We're talking about poetic activism. So it's about the relationship, and it's inviting. We have more people with us doing all these kind of things.
And hopefully these ideas can serve as inspiration for each therapist to move differently in their own practices and lives. And because there is no one way of doing things, I always like to tell people that, you're gonna have to find your own way. But the important thing to me is, as you participate in these kinds of conversations, just sort of start to embody a way of being, a way of thinking about those things, a way of doing things that is more as important to practice as anything that you might say. So I really like to consider this as an inspiration, not a recipe or anything.
I think that we have a question from Lucia, and I think that she would like to make it loud. So I'm asking you, Alex and Silvia and Edgardo, if you are ready for switching to from simultaneous translation to consecutive translation.
Sí. Sí.
Yes, thank you. I am closing the room now.
Great.
Thank you, Silvia, and welcome Edgardo again.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So let's go to this continuous consecutive translation. I think that, yeah, it was Lucia Palma that had a question.
Sí, yo. ¿Se escucha?
Sí,
Vale. Voy a hablar en español, me siento más cómoda, ¿vale?
sí.
¿Podrían darnos algunos ejemplos personalmente de cómo hacen para mantenerse en esta postura de, digamos, curiosidad y de apertura a cuestionar y crear y mantener esta actitud política en su práctica terapéutica? Ejemplos muy aterrizados, ¿no? ¿En qué participan? ¿Qué hacen ustedes?
Yeah. Could you give some examples about how you bring into your practice and particularly in the context of therapy, of this attitude of curiosity, openness, seeing therapy as a political act?
Yeah, I can go. To me, it looks. I'm always looking to be slightly uncomfortable in my practice. So.
Sí, una de las cosas que puede ocurrir es que puedo
I can understand English, but I can if I hear the persons I can understand. But
sí, pero es para el resto de las personas que a lo mejor no.
Claro, sí, tienes razón. Gracias.
Okay. Así que una de las cosas que puede ocurrir es que yo puedo lucir un poco incierto o incómodo en el contexto de la terapia.
So I'm always going back and forth between my inner dialogue and what's going on in conversation.
Así que hay un vaivén entre mi diálogo interno y lo que está ocurriendo en la conversación.
And whenever I'm feeling too comfortable or I feel like I've already got the answer I've already got this covered.
Así que una vez si ocurre que pienso que yo tengo la contestación o ya yo conozco todo lo que hay que saber sobre esto,
I immediately question myself and start asking, what am I not seeing? What other ways of understanding this are there?
Inmediatamente entonces me empiezo a cuestionar y me empiezo a preguntar qué es lo que no estoy viendo o qué otras formas de pensar pueden estar relacionadas con esta situación o de entendimiento.
And just one more thing, I always like to check that with the person that I'm talking to.
Y además siempre me gusta cotejar esto con la persona con la que estoy conversando.
Is what we're doing working for you? Could we do this differently? So making the other person part of that conversation.
Así que puedo preguntarle si lo que estamos haciendo está funcionando para ti, si hay una manera distinta que podría servirte mejor. Y por lo tanto, me interesa hacer a la persona partícipe de nuestra conversación.
I want to try to answer that question too.
Sí.
I told you about my experience facilitating a support group for people living with HIV/AIDS.
Así que sí, les conté anteriormente sobre mi experiencia con un grupo de apoyo con personas con HIV.
And at that moment, when they are facing this problem of not having medicines, because there's a shortage of, they're not having access to the medication for HIV medication.
Okay. Así que hay momentos donde no han podido tener acceso a los medicamentos para tratar la condición.
Then I begin to talk with them and ask them what they would like to do in that situation.
Así que empiezo a conversar con ellos y le empiezo a preguntar qué les gustaría hacer ante esta situación.
And then some of them begin to say that they should do something. They should protest. They should challenge the public professionals of the public health because of that.
Así que varios de ellos pueden decir que deben hacer algo, deben protestar o deben cuestionar el servicio de salud pública.
Then I try to go ahead with that conversation. I sustain that topic of the conversation. I didn't change that to more psychological thinking.
Así que yo continué en ese tema de conversación. No intenté cambiar la conversación a un lenguaje más psicológico.
But some of them at that time, they said, oh, nobody knows that I'm HIV positive. I can't do that. It will bring so many problems to me.
Okay. Pero algunos de ellos dijeron, sí, pero es que nadie sabe que yo soy positivo de HIV. Por lo tanto, no puedo hacerlo público.
Then we try to talk together about who wants to do what in order to respect the possibilities, different possibilities they have at that moment.
Así que en ese momento empezamos a conversar sobre qué y quién puede hacer qué cosa para poder crear la posibilidad de incluir a todos los que están participando.
And then I asked them how they want me to help them on that situation.
Y entonces les pregunté cómo ellos entendían que yo podría apoyarlos o ayudarlos en esa situación.
And then, everything happened. So it's just an example of how in the interaction, in the conversation that we have with our clients, we can have these political gains.
Así que esto es un ejemplo de cómo en las interacciones que podemos tener con nuestros clientes podemos incluir esta perspectiva política.
And I think there's a really nice example in our book. And I would like to invite Pedro to talk about that example because he was a therapist. I was not the therapist. Pedro, do you remember that case you had in which the wife was telling that they have communication problems?
Mm-hmm.
And would you like to talk about that example, Pedro? I think because it's a really good one of how to, to think about values and at the same time not imposing an agenda and
yeah. Así que Pedro le está preguntando a Pedro si quiere compartir un ejemplo que aparece en el texto que ellos publicaron sobre una esposa que está hablando de dificultades de comunicación, en la comunicación.
Yes, Emerson, thank you for inviting me to talk about it. Before that, I just want to say that the example you're giving also makes me think of the importance of therapists using our own power in favor of others.
Sí, antes de dar el ejemplo, quiero reflexionar sobre lo que Emerson había compartido, porque ilustra un ejemplo de cómo como terapeutas podemos estimular el poder en los demás.
So this example, I was seeing this woman who comes to therapy and she says that she needs
We lost Pedro.
Pedro, creo que lo perdimos.
My
Pedro,
bad.
We got him.
Okay,
Lo tenemos.
sorry. Yeah, so I was seeing this woman in therapy, and she asked me to learn new communication skills so she could be a better wife in her troubled relationship.
Así que vine a comencé a ver a una señora que vino donde mí solicitando para aprender nuevas destrezas de comunicación para que pudiera ser una mejor esposa.
And my first response in my inner dialogue was, as a feminist, that's not a good request.
Y mi primera respuesta dentro de mi diálogo interno es que como una feminista, eso no es un pedido apropiado.
And then I'm listening to her and I'm trying to talk to myself about my first reaction.
Así que la estoy escuchando y estoy conversando conmigo mismo también sobre esa reacción que tuve.
And I'm saying to myself, you're just another man who wants to tell her what's good for her life.
Tú eres otro hombre que está tratando de decirle lo que a ella le conviene en su vida.
So what I did was I talked to myself and I said to me, well, collaborating with her request, trying to understand it better, is a political stance.
Así que entonces me di cuenta que colaborando con ella, tratar de entender mejor su posición es en sí mismo un acto político.
So that's where we started. I was trying to answer, to respond to her request, but also inviting her to consider the effects of that in her life.
Así que de ahí comenzamos invitándola a ella a pensar sobre lo que estaba pidiendo y también a considerar el efecto de lo que estaba pidiendo sobre su vida.
And from that way of being together, we eventually got to issues of her relationship and why it's not just about her communicating better.
Y a través de ese tipo de conversación o diálogo, pudimos alcanzar un entendimiento sobre que no simplemente era algo que tenía que ver con ella, sino que habían asuntos en su relación que la estaba afectando.
Yeah. I'm going to send the article where this is published in case anyone wants to read it.
Sí. Voy a compartir la ficha del artículo donde esto se trabaja.
But it's also in our book, okay?
También está en nuestro libro.
That's a good point, Emerson, since we're talking about the books, so it makes sense that we say that there are examples in your books.
Sí, o sea, sí, es un buen punto, Emerson. Estamos hablando sobre el libro, así que es bueno señalar lo que está en el libro.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm sure that there are lots of questions here that would like to be asked and answered.
Sí, que tenemos algunos minutos, unos pocos minutos, y estoy seguro que hay muchas preguntas que quizás les gustaría que se contestaran.
But we'll have to leave it here. But before that, Alex and I would like to share with you some things. I will talk about the thing that I know the most, and then I will leave the floor to Alex. And I would like, perdón.
Sí, sin embargo, pues tenemos que ir terminando ahora. Lo que sí me gustaría es compartir con Alex algunos puntos sobre las publicaciones que tenemos.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to let you know that next week at this exact same time, we will be having another great conversation between one of the persons that we have here, Gergen, and it will be a dialogue with Michael Billick. I don't know if you are familiar with him, but sorry, Edgardo, just
Sí, que en este mismo espacio durante la semana que viene a esta misma hora vamos a tener una conversación entre Kenneth Gergen y Michael Billick.
Yeah, I think that Alex just wrote here, thank you very much, the link. And And yeah, and it would be a pleasure to have you here. And I will leave the floor to Alex.
Okay.
I just would like to thank you all very much, the participants, the authors, and all of those of you who attended. And thank you so much. It was a big pleasure to be here.
Sí, Alex acabó de colocar el enlace para la reunión de la semana que viene en el chat, así que pueden copiar eso y tenerlo disponible. Adrià quiere agradecerlos a todos y todas, tanto los participantes como los autores, por esta conversación y esta actividad que es tan fructífera.
And
yeah,
we all
finally,
thank
there's-
you, Adrià.
Yes.
Gracias, Adrià.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Adrià.
It is a big pleasure. And finally, yeah, about the translators, thank you very much. And actually, I want to say that next week we'll have a translation as well with Silvia, that today did a great job. So we will have her next week as well.
Así que también queremos compartir que la semana que viene vamos también a tener a Silvia como traductora de la actividad, que hizo un tremendo trabajo durante el día de hoy.
Y muchas gracias a los traductores, especialmente a ti y a Silvia.
Silvia, gracias.
So my turn to thank everyone, our speakers, our authors, Adrià for facilitating, and our translators, thanking everyone who attended today. And just a reminder that this conversation was recorded. The recording will be available in a few days in the Taos Institute Commons online community. It is also on our YouTube channel, so really available to everyone. Feel free to share it far and wide.
Sí, quiero agradecer a a todos los participantes, a los autores, a Adrià, a los traductores por esta actividad. Quiero dejarles saber que esta actividad está siendo grabada, que va a estar disponible en el site de Taos de los Comunes y además estará disponible en el canal de YouTube del Instituto.
And we invite you to continue to interact, share your own resources and comments in the online community.
Así que los quiero invitar a seguir interactuando, colocando sus propios recursos y sus comentarios en la comunidad de las redes del instituto.
And we have a few opportunities for you to continue on this topic, learning and conversing on this topic. So our next event on September 20th with Sheila McNamee and Pedro Martins present here, we'll talk about the role of therapy in challenging times.
Sí, tenemos una serie de actividades que siguen la temática del día de hoy. El 20 de septiembre, Sheila McNamee y Pedro Martins serán los anfitriones de una conversación sobre el papel de la terapia en tiempos difíciles.
And the link is in the chat. Thank you, Adrià.
Y
And
el enlace está en el chat también.
Another opportunity that is coming up this fall is to explore these ideas in more depth over our 6-week online course, Introduction to Social Construction.
Además, hay otro recurso que va a estar disponible durante el otoño a través del curso que se va a ofrecer sobre una introducción al construccionismo social.
So once again, thank you everyone for making this wonderful conversation, this great event happen today, and we wish you a nice rest of the day and hope to see you in the Taos Commons or other events.
Así que muchas gracias a todos y todas por su participación durante el día de hoy. Espero que los podamos ver tanto en los comunes o en otras actividades que celebremos juntos. Bien, buenas.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Adiós.